But let's talk about the Panthers. Baker Mayfield is there. I know you've been doing some great research and some looks into some things. I was optimistic about this for DJ Moore immediately. You showed me some interesting things right before we jumped on. We'll be excited to talk about those. One thing I've talked about on the show dating back to last year was an article I read over at the Ringer right when the Odell Beckham stuff in Cleveland blew up and Beckham eventually was released. It was written by Stephen Ruiz. Great look at essentially how maybe Baker Mayfield and Odell Beckham weren't particularly compatible, specifically between the second and third layers of the defense, kind of the deep intermediate part of the field, where because Baker Mayfield tends to be a pretty aggressive throw the ball pretty hard, there's some touch required on those throws. He wasn't very good in that range throwing to anyone. And that's where Beckham ran a lot of his routes into these, these deep digs and posts and some seam routes. Baker has thrown well over the top of the third, over the top of the safeties at times. We've seen some big long touchdowns from Donovan Peoples-Jones and some of those, big plays in the Browns offense over the years. But that was always really interesting to me. I thought it was a really good look at depth of, throw. And Steven, I just went and pulled that up, makes a really great point in it that pretty much very, very few quarterbacks can make all the throws. Like, that's a very popular framing, but that's not a particularly easy thing to do necessarily. And maybe that's just an area that Baker doesn't throw a ton to. So my immediate response was, this has to be good for DJ Moore then, because Baker's had some success and he's got to be pretty good in the shorter area of the field. But you had a little bit of a word of caution for me on that.
Well, partly we're dealing with some injuries last season, right? But Mayfield basically doesn't throw that successfully to any area of the field other than the deep middle. And that's a good area to throw well too, because you get some big plays there. And it's actually an area where in very limited targets, the DJ Moore has also done well. And you would expect to have better adjusted yard per attempt numbers on some of these deep passes. But Mayfield's over 14.6 in the last 4 years. Throwing to the deep middle, that's 60 targets. He's not been great to the deep left. He's not been great to the deep right. That's where more of the deep targets go. But then the other real issue here is that under 15 yards, he's just been bad, right? You have 6.2 AYA to the left, under 6. He's a 5.7, just right over the middle there. And then 6.6 out to the right. We're talking about over 1,300 targets to those spots. So it's not on a tiny sample. And I think that, when we think about how those throws work for him, you mentioned that he's got the arm strength, but it's really arm strength that only plays well when he's throwing the vertical ball straight, when he's not having to get the ball out to the sidelines and make that type of a throw. His arm strength suffers in those situations, and he's not great over the middle. Now, that was exaggerated some, and it was certainly exaggerated in that Week 17 game last year, where basically every ball is getting batted down. But similar things to what we see with Kyler Murray and some of the other quarterbacks that do struggle a little bit with height. He's not making those passes particularly well. So I do have some concerns about how he's going to fit with a variety of their weapons. And I think that while he brings competency to the position, and we think about how he finished the second half of 2020 with a nice run to finish that season when he's healthy, this is going to require some expert scheming by the Panthers staff. And that's also been controversial over the past several years. They fire an offensive coordinator. There are some disconnects between the head coach and the coordinators in terms of what they want to do. They've gotten very, very conservative when the quarterback play hasn't been there. And there's this possibility for that to be the case again this season. This doesn't come as a huge surprise when you talk about the numbers that we just went through, but you pull up the advanced stat tool and look at some of the different elements. And because we've got all kinds of great information from Sports Info Solutions pulled into there, you can look at 2019, you can look at 2020, you can look at 2021. And Baker Mayfield comes in sort of at the very bottom of the NFL when you're looking at like true starters, guys who've thrown 350 or more passes in each year. And in fact, 2019 and 2020, the guy who he's like right above in terms of catchable passes and on target passes is Sam Darnold. And so, when you think about some of those Robbie Anderson tweets where he didn't want Baker Mayfield as the QB, and I mean, he said that those were in jest. But when he's had to deal with some of the quarterback play he's dealt with recently, you can understand why someone who has statistics that fit a lot of those same categories, when you're not throwing catchable passes, when you're not hitting your guys, in stride, when they're not on target, that's very frustrating for the wide receivers. And then there are just limitations too, because of Baker Mayfield's physicality or lack thereof compared to some of the other starting quarterbacks in the NFL.
Yeah, and the first numbers you gave were from the great AYA app at RotoViz. Some awesome tools to break down this stuff. Obviously, RotoViz just loaded with tools. Always be looking at those things. It's really interesting as well, as you were saying that about his on-target percentage, his catchable target percentage, as well, to think about how the Browns have operated, because they've been a very run-first offense and a successful running team, the type of team that tends to improve the efficiency of the quarterback. In some cases, you're talking about, certainly there's a lot of play action that can come off of that. Some of Baker's bombs that we have seen, the deep balls have been off these play action rollouts after they've gotten Nick Chubb going, started to suck in the linebackers, maybe move the safeties up a little bit even into the box. And then you can go play action over the top to a speedster like a Donovan Peoples-Jones, where he has hit him some. It's not ideal when you have, coming from an offense that also is designed to try to create easier throws, basically, to try to force the defense to respect the run. And then he's throwing from, clean pockets. They've had a good offensive line. I mean, there's a lot of elements there that you say those stats, you say things like catchable targets and on target percentage. Maybe for a quarterback that's throwing on the run a lot, that's throwing under pressure a lot, you can make a lot of adjustments or try to think through that. But that was the other thing I was thinking, was like, if he's good, he should be able to do it in this Browns offense, and he hasn't. And so that's concerning. DJ Moore is now rising. I've seen him go in the middle of the third round. It seems like we're headed towards that type of a price. Told you before the show, get ready for a lot of DJ Moore in drafts the rest of the summer. I want to take him everywhere. This will be the best quarterback he's ever played with. He's shown an ability to succeed at all depths. That's why I was so in on him last year. I still want to take him. I don't care what you just said. But where are you at on DJ Moore? Especially if he lands in the middle of the third. Let's put it that way.
It's going to be tricky there, right? Because you are going to still be dealing with some efficiency elements. But when we look at the last couple of seasons, if you look at drawing targets, if you look at target depth, and so you have a combination there that gives you air yards, you look at something even like yards per target within the context of how poor the quarterback play has been. And DJ Moore is right outside that sort of top 5 group. And so you're obviously not going to have him up there with the big 3. You're not going to have him in the second round. But after that, you have to consider him, because he has that combination that you just talked about, where you have the before the target. He's also elite in terms of running with the ball in his hands. He can do all of the different depths, the different routes. And there are now ways that they can scheme this offense. And you talk about how the Browns have the good offensive line play. They try and make you respect the run. The Panthers have added Deontay Foreman to get that sort of big back in there. Still, I think, ideally they would use Chuba successfully in some way, shape, or form as a breather back. But they're going to probably try and make the defense respect. And when you have Christian McCaffrey, that's going to be a little bit easier to do. Now, the best way to use McCaffrey would be on these sort of short, over-the-middle types of routes where Jarvis Landry would also tell you it's not just Odell Beckham, that maybe Baker Mayfield doesn't thrive on some of those plays. If the scheme is what it needs to be, one of the things that you see is you look at the catchable, you look at the on target, but then you contrast that with his air yard conversion, and Mayfield's actual numbers, which is what we care about, were better than some of the peripherals. And some of that has to do with the scheme that you talked about. Some of that has to do with the fact that he's actually hit on some of these deep passes. You think about how the deep passes can skew things. And we look at Marquise Brown's numbers in a variety of different contexts. When we look at whether or not we want to draft him, we're saying, well, he hasn't been as good as you would expect. If you add on 3 or 4 of those deep targets, several of which were in the end zone that Brown dropped, suddenly he looks like a superstar. The flip side is a little bit true with Baker Mayfield here. If some of those deep bombs don't connect, then he looks really bad. And so we have to be aware of that. And at the same time, we have to be also give him credit for the fact that he probably can make this offense work if the Panthers are moving the ball at all, which is something they didn't do in 2021. That should elevate both players. And so, I look at these guys and there's not a lot of room for Christian McCaffrey to grow where, he's in that kind of 103 range, but you can go back to the 101. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do a couple of RV Triflex dynasty leagues in the past couple of weeks, some startups, and drafted Christian McCaffrey in both of them. One, we actually drafted him very early. The second one, he falls into the third round, which I think is kind of insane when you look at how dynasty works and how it's even more of you talk about the dead zone for running backs in dynasty, and it's basically everybody after the first 5 guys. If you can get like 2 of the top 10 backs and ideally at least one of them young, but you have Christian McCaffrey up there, you think about all of the value that drafters are burning when they use picks between rounds 6 and 12 on running backs. The fact that you can get Christian McCaffrey in that range and has this Marshall Faulk type of upside, even with all of the issues and even with all of the red flags with Baker Mayfield, I think that now you can really dream about that again. And you have 3 very clear-cut stars at the top. And despite my preference for the wide receivers and my note that when you pull up the range of outcomes tool and you see Cooper Kupp and who are his comps, and there are all that big run of seasons by Antonio Brown, and I think you can very easily justify taking him there, probably still makes sense to have McCaffrey and Taylor as the top 2 guys on the board.
Yeah, as you were saying that, it's maybe a little concerning when we talk about these on-target throws and all of these things in terms of McCaffrey's receiving. And yet, to your point, we're sort of saying Mayfield's been so bad that he's only been slightly better than Sam Darnold. And none of the other quarterbacks that McCaffrey has played with have been, it's been the same issue as DJ Moore. I just said it's the best QB DJ Moore's ever played with. It will be a slight improvement, probably. It's just that it might not be as much of an improvement as it seems some of the initial reaction is indicating. But McCaffrey has been what he's been, even with quarterbacks that can't make on-target short throws. And so...
Cam Newton is not a great underneath passer.
Right. No, he's throwing 90 miles an hour at guys underneath. Who's the other guy they had for that 1 year? Kyle Allen or something? He wasn't very efficient. I think he was better underneath, and he was really bad down the field. But it's never been like quarterback has created Christian McCaffrey. So I'm certainly not saying, these on-target things as it relates to Baker Mayfield. You can definitely see Christian McCaffrey running his little option route and being wide open 5 yards over the middle, and Baker still can't make that throw for some reason. But then we've also seen that happen to McCaffrey before, and he's still been very, very good. So I'm still willing to bet on him, and I like what you were saying there. Happy to hear you've been taking him Dynasty as well, because I took him earlier in the offseason. But yeah, this is a guy that can just get open at will, even out of the backfield when, there should be linebackers and people around. He's creating space. And so very comfortable with this being a boost to McCaffrey, or for the people who needed a boost to McCaffrey, basically, is the way I would put it, because I was already feeling very comfortable with McCaffrey and that ceiling and that type of elite upside. I loved your comments on the Dynasty as well, how it's sort of all a dead zone after these elite, potentially elite running backs. And McCaffrey, we know, has that Marshall Faulk type potential. Maybe his best days are behind him, but he could still have a better season than he's had to date. And that's another way of framing it, especially over the last couple of years where he's been banged up. So McCaffrey sort of locked into the top 3 now. DJ Moore, you are a little concerned about in the 3rd round. Hopefully the market agrees and he slips back towards a 3-4 turn at some point. I'm going to have to come up with some creative arguments to get you to want to take him over some of the other receivers that are available in the 3rd round. Robbie Anderson, any interest in him later in drafts? I'm kind of okay with that idea, because there's not really a lot of depth at wide receiver there, or pass catchers generally. other than obviously McCaffrey and DJ Moore. There's some contingency based upside if either of those guys miss some time. Robbie Anderson's 2021 was terrible, and that's why the market has reacted how it has, but he still has a pretty nice contract. We should expect him to play quite a bit. Terrace Marshall did nothing as their, big receiver addition last year. Is he somebody that you'd consider late?
Yeah, and have been drafting him not a lot, but a decent amount in round 17, round 18, that type of range. You talk about his season last year, and it's almost unfathomable kind of where he was with that, where his yards per target drops to 4.8. His racer is down there at 0.45. We were concerned about the way that he was deployed, or the contrast between the way Moore and Anderson were deployed in 2020, where DJ Moore was the deep guy and Robbie Anderson, not exactly underneath, but below 10 yards in terms of air yards per target. Not exactly the way he's been used before. He jumped back up to 10.6 last year. That's still not using him as a deep threat, but they essentially went away from those passes. I think he's someone where we talk about a field stretcher and what Mayfield potentially does well. I think you could see some deep shots. If they hit, then you're golden, especially in best ball leagues. But at the very least, I think that allows the offense there to clear some space for DJ Moore. And you talked about Terrace Marshall, and he's someone where you wouldn't think that Robbie Anderson at 4.8 could have someone go underneath him in terms of yards per target on the team, but Marshall did at 4.6. Marshall obviously also not demanding any targets, not getting any target share there. The interesting player, I think, in this group could end up being Tommy Tremble, who is just a big, extremely athletic player, not even exactly a receiver, although he caught 20 of his 36 targets last year, but was used around the goal line, vulturing some of these potential touchdown runs. Probably won't be used nearly as much in that role if Christian McCaffrey is back and healthy. But if you're looking at kind of a deeper breakout guy, someone you might draft in leagues that go to round 24, or dynasty leagues that go beyond 20, I think that he's interesting as a breakout candidate who actually played moderately well last year within the context of how bad this offense was. And because he didn't come in as a big name either, I mean, he's very, very much under the radar. So if you're looking for sleepers, you could look at his name. Where are you on Anderson here after he's been used in such a strange fashion the past 2 years? Obviously some discontent. He mentions that he might retire, and then he says, well, obviously I'm not really going to retire, but frustration with how this has gone. We even heard that he might have been in some ways responsible for the offensive coordinator getting fired. And not to put that on him, obviously that's not what happened, but that he wasn't excited about the previous coordinator. He's maybe not excited with the direction they're going in terms of Baker Mayfield. He's someone I've always liked, thought that if he got into the right situation, he could thrive, but it just doesn't seem like it's going to actually ever happen for him, where he'll have the type of QB that he can go out there and have one of these big seasons and close out his career on this sort of high note.
I think you said that well. The one little thing to think about or add is if Baker is good at these deep shots, I mean, that would seem to jive with Robbie Anderson pretty well, right? If he's running some downfield routes, maybe you hit on a few long touchdowns. And I mean, for people who are doing best ball drafts and those types of things, if you're building stacks, if you're doing different, I mean, you can definitely at Anderson's price just sort of be playing for maybe 3 or 4 long touchdowns throughout the course of the season in best ball. And then there's maybe some upside that he gets back to what he did in 2020 in terms of target share and in terms of really being a pretty big part of the offense.